They called her Lot 17, barefoot, proud, and silent under the midday sun. When the cowboy tossed $2 to claim her, the crowd laughed, believing the deal was done. But she raised her chin, eyes blazing like fire under the dust. "You'll regret this," she said, voice steady as the plains wind. "I won't obey." That moment split the town's silence like a bullet through glass. No one knew then, least of all him, that her defiance would burn through every law, every chain, and every man who thought he owned her. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Around them, the market resumed its clatter until a hush thickened and pushed the noise away, a hush that felt like the land itself listening. Someone spat, someone muttered that she should be grateful, someone said she should say thank you. She did not. Instead, she let the title Lot 17 be what the town wanted, while her eyes named a different future, one that would not be sold, one that would not bow. Eli watched her, and for the first time, or for a time that felt like the first, he saw himself reflected in the crude polished surface of the town's cruelty. He saw a man who had chosen a small, hard coin over a larger, softer current. Around him, hats tipped and faces turned away, as if the sun had suddenly shown them what they tried not to see. The auction closed, the hammer fell, and the world moved on outwardly. But beneath the boots and the spurs, the ground had shifted. Her words had split the town's silence like a bullet through glass, and though laughter tried to stitch the fracture closed, something vital had already begun to bleed through, a truth none of them had currency enough to buy back. They called her Lot 17, though names lived in her bones like prayers. Bare feet pressed to the dust, long dark braids threaded with feathers swinging once when the auctioneer banged his mallet, sunlight cutting the air like a blade. She stood small against the crowd, yet enormous in the way a storm can be enormous before it breaks. Skin fair to medium, a simple light-colored bralette clinging to the sweat of the day, a short wrap skirt patterned in orange, brown, beige and blue-gray with a fringe that whispered with every shift of her weight. Men pointed at the cattle, at the tools, then at her, as if she were another tool to be traded. The cowboy who plucked at fate that afternoon was Eli, late 20s, maybe 30, dark hair shattered by a wide-brimmed hat, a light blue shirt open at the throat, a vest that had seen promises and missed them both. He tossed $2 onto the block like coins dropped from a gambler's pocket, a clink that sounded small and monstrous at once. Laughter spread like a stinking shawl across Dust Creek. The auctioneer called numbers. Someone joked about bargains, and the men leaned forward to inspect ownership as if ownership could be measured by coin. But when those two pieces of silver hit the wood, everything stalled, as if the town held its breath to see what shape shame would take. Her chin lifted. Her eyes were dark fires under the dust, and in that lift there was the quiet of winter and the thunder of a coming river. She spoke once. It was not a plea. It was not a bargaining. It was a law cut clean through the low murmur of men. "You'll regret this. I won't obey." The voice was steady as plains wind, small and impossible to ignore. The crowd shifted. Jokes fell off lips like loose teeth. For some, the words were fuel, sparks to whip them up into louder cruelty. For others, the words were a mirror, and the mirror argued back. Eli felt the weight of those syllables land on him as if they were leaded cloth. He had bought many things out here: cattle, a claim on a stretch of land, the quiet loyalty of townsfolk who owed more to silence than justice. But he had never bought another person. $2 were nothing and everything. They were a tax on his conscience and a show of his power, and when he looked at her, the coinage in his hand felt like mud. The girl, this woman, this Lot 17, did not flinch. She did not flint into the role their tongues had carved for her. Her hands, calloused, slender, hung at her sides. The fringe on her skirt trembled like grass warning of a storm. Eli led her out of Dust Creek with the slow, practiced gait of a man who'd moved freight and livestock through storms and death. But this load made his shoulders feel wrong. Her wrists were bound with a freight rope that looked older than the town. Yet the binding did not make her small. It made the space between them taut, a line both physical and moral, and every step they took raised dust that settled like judgment on his boots. She walked barefoot, skirt fringe whispering against the packed earth, long dark braids swinging with feathers catching the sun, her skin a fair to medium burn from the plains, the light-colored bralette clinging to the curve of her shoulders where the heat and humiliation had rubbed the sheen into a stubbornness. She did not look at him. The road unfurled ahead like a promise he had no right to make, a horizon that swallowed the town's easy scoffs and left only wind and the hard knowledge of what had passed for a sail. Eli's jaw was a hard line. The wide brim of his hat shaded his eyes but could not hide the quick twitch when she shifted, as if the rope around her wrists tightened with each breath and looped around his conscience too. He had not intended cruelty. He had intended to square accounts, to take something the world now allowed men like him to take and call it business. But her silence was a blade turned inward on him. It cut deeper than any insult thrown by the cattle boys in their laughter. The land around them felt different. Even the grass seemed to lean away as if remembering the wrongs done and waiting to see which way the next storm would blow. At first the ride was a steady in small violences, a jerk of the rein, the soft clink of spurs, the occasional muttered remark from Mila that was more habit than speech. He glanced at her once, only once, and saw a face that had known commerce and cruelty, that had been named Lot 17 and catalogued by men who believed coin could render a human thing silent and small. She carried herself like an amber, contained, terrible if faint. His horse stepped over a dead prairie dog, a hawk circled, indifferent. Water in the far distance flashed like a promise neither of them could yet claim. Behind them, Dust Creek shrank to dust and sound, voices receding until the town became a rumor. And the closer they came to the scrub and low hills, the more Eli felt the truth of her words from the auction like a stone in his gut. "You'll regret this. I won't obey." He tried to tell himself she'd been bargaining, that threats were theater to unsettle a buyer. He told himself that to sleep at night. But the more he told himself, the less convinced he became. Something in the way she watched the horizon, steady, unblinking, felt like the steady burn of someone who had measured her life in losses and had decided, quietly, that one more loss could not be catalogued. Eli's hands, calloused from rope and reins, from the small arithmetic of frontier survival, fumbled at the knot as if he might loosen it without speaking. He remembered his father's ledger, neat columns of debts and credits, how the family had folded when the crops failed and the men around them learned to sell what they called surplus, land, tools, sometimes dignity. He thought, horrified at the thought, that in buying her he had only repeated the ledger's cruelty with different ink. She did not plead. She did not beg. Once, a bird called and the sound hung between them like a question. She answered it softly, not with words but with the tilt of her head toward the ridge, as if mapping a path only she could read. Eli felt a strange pull, an anger at himself for feeling it. He wanted to be stern, to remind her of rope and coin, to reassert the false geometry of power that money drew in towns like Dust Creek. Instead, he rode with the weight of someone who had walked into a storm thinking it would cool his fever and found it only made him feel hotter, more exposed. The land watched, the wind gathered stories and carried them across the plain. As the sun slanted low and the shadows lengthened, the hills ahead took on the look of bunkers, places to hide, places to hold, places where a promise might be tested. Eli realized then that the ride out was less a removal than a crossing. Leaving the town did not leave the town's wrongs behind. It simply moved them into a new geography, one where the law was thinner and consequence was thicker. She, Lot 17, no name but a number to the men at the auction, kept her eyes on the horizon and did not look back. The cabin in the hills was a squat thing of weathered boards and a sagging porch, a place that had kept its silence like a secret. And when Eli pushed open the door and led her inside, it felt less like bringing a prize home and more like importing a storm into a small room. He set a tin cup and a bowl of stood on the rough table and watched her as if watching might rearrange the terms of what had happened. She sat on the floor with knees drawn, the hem of her short patterned skirt brushing the plank, fringe trembling like a held breath, braids heavy with feathers falling over her shoulder. The light-colored bralette darkened at the seams where sweat and sun had mapped her skin. Fair to medium flesh that seemed at once exposed and armored. He offered her food and she took only water, palms cupping the din like a fragile pack, eyes scanning the tree line through the window as if the forest were a map in an ancient script only she could read. There was no pleading in the way she refused, only a careful, precise retreat into herself, a refusal that read like a refusal to be catalogued, and it made him feel both foolish and afraid. Eli moved about the cabin with the clumsy rituals of a man trying to turn fact into comfort. He stoked the small stove, hung boots on a peg, smoothed a blanket across a cot, all the while feeling the tightness of the rope at her wrists like a second horizon he could not cross. His hands were rough from reins and ledger entries, from the small brutal arithmetic of frontier life where debts were paid with coin and sometimes with people, and for the first time since the auction he felt the sum of those hands adding up against him. Outside, the hills drank the last of the light and the wind began to speak in low tones, rattling the shutters with stories Eli did not want to hear. Inside, he tried on explanations like codes. He told himself he had been doing what a man in his place must do, that he had not meant harm, that $2 silver were a poor thing to disentangle a life with, but were all a tired ledger allowed. But each attempted rationalizing bent under the weight of her steady gaze when she looked his way, a look that measured not just his features but the ledger choices behind them. Night folded over the cabin like a black shawl, and the small lamp cast long shadows that bristled at the edges of the room. She lay awake on the floor, back to the wall, as if the wood itself might shield her from the miserly geometry of men who bought and sold. And in the dark her voice came once, soft, not entreating but declarative. "You'll regret this?" And those words were neither threat nor prophecy so much as a naming, the naming that settled like salt into him, into the small wound of his conscience. He tried to sleep and dreamed instead of his brother, a younger man with the same sharp jaw, who had taken foolish risks and paid with a life that had never quite had its due. In the dream the brother's face blurred and merged with hers, braids and feathers in her stubborn mouth, and Eli woke soaked with the image, breath knocking against ribs that suddenly felt like borrowed rooms. The cabin's four walls, which he had thought would make a boundary between them and the lawless spaces beyond, felt instead like a thin skin stretched over something raw. Freedom offered inside these walls was an iron thing, safe because it kept her from running, cruel because it kept her in. He found himself watching the trees as she had watched them, imagining the jagged line of escape routes, the places where a barefoot woman could disappear and leave a man to his debts and to the town's shame. He heard the distant creak of a wheel on the main road and imagined voices turning toward the hills. The image tightened his chest into a fist. She slept finally, curled like a small animal. Jordan laxed but Brown not surrendered, and he sat by the dim lamp, hands folded, counting coins in his mind not as currency but as weights, $2 silver that had bought a moment and set a reckoning in motion. The rope lay coiled on the floor where he had placed it, frayed and ordinary, an instrument of their meeting, yet it seemed now to hum with consequence. All night the wind rehearsed its vocabulary, whispers of justice, of retribution, of small brave resistances, and Eli listened until the line between guilt and duty thinned into one sharp thing. Dawn would come with decisions, he knew. The hills would know whether he would stand with the ledger or with the ember beside him. The fire in the stove hissed like a small animal and the cabin seemed to contract around Eli, pressing his shoulders into the wood as if the place itself wanted confession. Sleep came not as relief but as a slow slide into something ancient, and the dream that took him was a ruin of memories he had tried to bury. His brother's face first, younger, the same dark hair and stubborn jawline. A man who'd chased danger like a habit and paid for it with a bullet years earlier when settlers and tempers met and the world made a small, ugly law of it. In the dream the brother's features blurred and reassembled into the woman's face. Long, braided dark brown hair threaded with feathers, fair to medium skin lit by an impossible light. The simple light-colored bralette and the short patterned skirt with orange, brown, beige and blue-gray running like a map across the cloth, her fringe trembling in a wind that had no origin. And when she spoke in the dream the auction words came back raw. "You'll regret this," echoing off the timber, and in that echo Eli felt a ledger he could not balance, debts paid in coin, debts unpaid in blood. The $2 silver he had thrown across the auction block turned in his hands into coins that were warm and bleeding. They multiplied into entries in his father's neat book, columns that swallowed faces, until the room filled with the rustle of paper and the taste of iron. He woke with sweat cooling in the hollows of his ribs, breath staccato, haunted by the smear of images that refused to separate. The brother's last laugh, the girl's steady eyes, the rope's frayed fibers like the pages of history unraveling. Guilt arrived not as fury but as a slow, patient thing that sat down beside him and began to count. He thought of his brother's mistakes and how the town politely renamed the misfortunes, then folded them under a carpet of silence. He thought of the auctioneer's calloused hand, the men who had laughed when 2 coins bought another human, the snickers that tried to disguise a kind of hunger for domination as mere business. He saw, with a clarity that made his tongue heavy, how easily a man trained in ledgers could train himself to see a person as an item, how the arithmetic of survival hardened into a creed: profit, ownership, indifference. The girl, Lot 17, the number pinned to her by the same men who listed cattle and tools, moved in his mind like a flame in a glass jar, contained, dangerous if uncorked. He remembered the way she had refused food the night before, taking only water as if swallowing too much might drown the resolve that kept her from becoming what they tried to sell. The way her eyes watched tree lines as though plotting a map out of memory and bone. That small set to her mouth that made him imagine she'd been cataloged and misnamed so often she'd learned to translate names into strategies for survival. In the dark he imagined the rope in the corner, the frayed loops like questions, and he imagined himself loosening it and tightening it and finally letting it go. Motions of a man trying to pick a moral stance as if from a belt of tools. He stayed awake as the night did its work, listening to the hills breathing, measuring each small creak of timber as if it were a verdict. Remorse is not a clean thing. It nests in the body and waits for permission to feed. Eli felt it crawl through his hands, into the palms that had handled reins and coins and the odd cruel humor of frontier justice, until his fingers felt foreign to him. He thought of running back to Dust Creek with Herindo, pretending the ledger had been paid in full, imagining the sheriff's face when the truth spilled across his desk. He imagined other possibilities too, cutting the rope and riding away into country that claimed no ownership, walking the girl to a place where names meant more than numbers. The dream left him with a weight that was not only about debt but about identity, who he had been taught to be, and who he might yet become if he let the amber in that woman's gaze teach him something expensive and true. Dawn would come with decisions, the cabin's walls promised, and with the gray light he could already feel the old coins cooling into cold facts. He rubbed at his face, tasted smoke and his brother's memory and the salt of his own fear, and realized he was trapped in a geometry more complex than ledger lines, angles made of choices, of loyalty and shame, and the thin, dangerous space between owning something and being owned by what you have done. Dawn arrived thin and pale, a blade of light through the cabin's single window, and with that light came motion, quiet, deliberate, as if the morning itself respected the gravity of what would happen next. She had kept a small shard of glass hidden beneath the fringe of her skirt, a sliver she had pocketed when men thought no one watched, and when the first gray bled across the floorboard she worked the shard with fingers practiced from necessity, not luxury, until the frayed rope at our wrists surrendered like a bad bargain, the knot coming loose with the softest of sounds. She did not hesitate, braids swinging, feathers catching the morning breeze, the light-colored bralette clinging to her like a second skin, the patterned wrap skirt whispering as she moved. She slid to the threshold and for a fraction of a breath stood like a statue carved of muscle and memory, fair to medium skin shining with dew and resolve. Then she stepped into the brush, barefoot on cold earth, and the world seemed to inhale. The creak of the door woke Eli, not the shout or the scuffle he might have expected, but a single human noise that split him from sleep and inside. Once, he rose, hands already reaching for the old Colt he kept on the peg though he did not intend to shoot, and saw her figure vanish into the trees, a small moving thing with a hawk's steadiness in her shoulders. For a beat he simply watched, the wide brim of his hat shadowing his face, the light blue shirt slightly unbuttoned at the neck catching the morning vest dark against the pale wood of the cabin, and then a panic that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with fear for another person's body propelled him forward. He mounted with clumsy haste, spurs clinking like the beginning of a prayer, his horse sinking to his heart's quick rhythm. He did not chase with the cheap cruelty of men who hunted what they considered property. He chased with something nearer to a guardian's terror, imagining her stumbling on fevered rocks, imagining wolves drawn by a lone footfall, imagining the law's men finding a woman alone and answering with their blunt justice. The path through the trees was narrow and the horse's hoofs threw up small clouds of dust. She ran with the barefoot surety of someone who had navigated creek beds and roots all her life, skirt fringe brushing branches, braids slapping her back like signal flags, and every so often she glanced over her shoulder not with hope of rescue but to measure distance, as if distance could be a decision, not merely a fact. Eli's breath came in ragged puffs. He had thought escape would feel like theft, but seeing her move free made him understand the theft had been precise and simple. His money had bought nothing but a moral wound that now burned in his chest. The hills closed around them, a green tunnel dotted with sunlit clearings, and in those pauses the land seemed to judge them both, asking which of them belonged to it and which were merely trespassers in its story. She reached a stream and the water flashed at her ankles. She paused, cupped a hand, drank, and in that small ordinary act Eli saw the fierce, necessary humanity that no auction block could erase. She was not property to be refreshed. She was a person reclaiming the things that kept her alive. He pulled his horse to the bank, the animal stamping nervously, and for a heartbeat he considered dismounting, lowering the gun, offering a simple apology that might have been the admission of a man newly ashamed. Instead, he watched her turn to the farther ridge and saw something in her posture that made his throat close, a stubborn refusal to be offered pity. He chased not to capture but to be near enough to keep her from harm, and that nearness shifted the geometry of what had been a transaction into something like a betrothal of conscience, his conscience betting the life of his actions against the life of another. Branches tore at his shirt, a thorn scuffed his cheek, the sun climbed and burned the damp out of the air. She moved with a soundless speed that belied her barefoot feet, and every time she vanished into a hollow he feared she would not rise again. At one point she stumbled, just once, and the motion made him yelp as if in physical pain. She did not fall, only faltered, and the way she caught herself with a hand to the earth was a small prayer of survival. He shouted her name once, clumsy and useless, and the echo came back then. She didn't answer. She had always been more accustomed to listening than to calling. When he finally closed on her, the ridge between them a breath, she stood and faced him, not easing, not softening. Sunlight caught the feather in her braid and lit it like a banner. He slid from the saddle and for the first time stood exactly level with what he had tried to own. The rope lay at his feet in his fist, a useless thing now, and she looked at him with an expression that was neither hatred nor gratitude but a careful assessment of whether he had the courage to undo what he had done. The wild had not taken her, yet, but it had been waiting with teeth and weather in the unforgiving arithmetic of the plains. Eli realized then that he had chased a different danger, the danger of being left to live with the knowledge that his actions might have cost her everything. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. He found her where the river ran wide and slow, where the water held the sky like a lyre and the bank sloped soft as a promise. She stood ankle deep with bare feet sunk into dark silt, patterned skirt caught at her thigh, fringe damp and clinging, long braids swinging with feathers that nodded to the current. The light-colored bralette darkened at the straps by water and sweat, skin fair to medium freckled with dust. She seemed part riverbank and part weather, a person who had known how to make the world yield without asking permission. Eli pulled the horse to a stop and dismounted with the old, careful motion of a man who thinks ceremony can thin urgency. The wide brim of his hat shaded his eyes, but not the tremor in his hand as it lifted the colt. He spoke with the blunt cadences of a life used to commands. "Back," he said, voice low and practiced, but the word carried less like an order and more like the last brittle sheet of a roof ready to peel away. She didn't move. The river cut a soft hiss between them and the bird calls stitched the gap. She lifted her chin and in the small set of her jaw there was the same line that had stopped the auctioneer's chatter, a line Eli had thought he could cross with money. "You think you own me," she said, words like flint struck against stone, and she said them without appeal. "But you don't even own yourself." The sentence landed on him as if thrown by a hand more honest than his own. For a moment his finger tightened on the trigger, a reflex shaped by the frontier's rough grammar. But the gun felt suddenly enormous, heavy with consequence beyond the metal, and the sight of her, free enough to stand in water while men still argued ledger lines, made something in him unravel. He had intended to keep control through the narrow measure of a barrel and a rope. Instead he realized control had been a theater where he'd been playing a part written by other men, and the script was wearing thin. The river lapped at her cuffs and caught the light. It seemed to ask nothing of her and to give everything back in reflection. He had never been a cruel man by the worst definitions. He had debts, bad choices, a taste for easy absolution and small coin. But cruelty sometimes arrived as a set of conveniences, people measured as assets, feelings ledgered away. Her voice, steady, quiet, without flourish, named him not his villain but his man, which was worse. It forced him to see the scaffolding of excuses he'd built, his family's failure, the town's needs, the ledger's hungry columns. In that strip of shallow water she held authority he had not earned. She held a sovereignty made of refusal. She watched him with an intelligence that was not seeking his forgiveness and not asking for pity. She was appraising whether he would remain a man who bought things and then lay claim to them, or whether he might be a man who could look at what he had done and choose differently. Around them the world was patient, reeds whispered, clouds marched in slow indifference, and the current moved as if erasing the edges of history with patient fingers. He thought of the $2 silver clinking on the auction block, small and ridiculous like the first stones of a wall that had come to separate him from what he valued. He thought of his brother's blurry face from the dream and how easily a ledger had replaced an aim. He thought of the rope now lying coiled in his saddlebag like a confession waiting to be confessed. The finger on the trigger loosened until the gun was a useless weight in his hand. Shame is a cold thing that rushes into the blood, and it rushed, slow, sure. Eli lowered the Colt. The motion felt like a surrender, but not to her. It felt like a surrender to truth. He did not take his eyes from her. He could not, because she had become a mirror that showed him the smallness of his courage and the breadth of his cowardice. When the barrel dipped, the sunlight struck it and the flash seemed petty, an artifice against a river that did not judge. The current caught a fallen leaf and spun it, and for the first time since the auction he felt his authority slip away. Nothing theatrical, simply the soft, steady disintegration of a posture that had been propped up by habit and fear. He stepped forward an inch, not with the swagger of a man reclaiming dominance, but with the tentative humility of someone approaching a wound to see if it would speak. She met his movement with neither flinch nor forgiveness. She only watched, careful and uncompromising. The river carried away his last claim like a thin scrap of paper dissolving, and with it went an arrogance he had not known to inventory. The law in Dusk Creek could not reach this eddy. The transaction that had seemed legal before crumbled into the water's plain truth. Ownership is a lie when applied to living things. He felt faintly astonished at his own relief. What had once been a relief to possess shifted now into a terror of having to live with the undoing of it. The current moved on, indifferent and clean, and the two stood on its bank, one whose life was catalogued by men and one whose life had refused cataloging. Around them the hills stood witness. The world resumed its quiet business, but Eli's horizon had changed. He had lowered a gun and in doing so let the river take the last of his authority. He did not force her back into the cabin. That would have been the simpler cruelty, the tidy arithmetic of a town that balanced ledgers with lives. And instead Eli walked ahead with the awkward rights of a man who had suddenly discovered his own failing, stacking wood, checking the latch, setting the kettle, small actions meant to look like atonement. She followed by choice, barefoot, long braids threaded with feathers swinging, the light-colored bralette clinging where sweat had met sun, the patterned wrap skirt whispering at her thighs. She watched the tree line beyond the window as if the world outside held a language she still read. A hush gathered between them that was not hostile but uncertain, an electric pause that felt like a wire stretched and waiting to be tested. Would it sing or snap? The cabin's four walls, once a shelter he trusted, felt rearranged by her presence. No prison exactly, but not yet refuge. Eli moved with unfamiliar care. He set a blanket on the cot, then folded it, set a tin cup and bowl, then hesitated, aware that charity could look like penance. She accepted only water and drank with a steady patience that suggested reclamation rather than supplication. He sat opposite her and spoke, not to lecture but because silence had become another accusation, his voice low, listing small confessions of debts and the habit of seeing people as numbers. Her reply was spare. You bought what you thought you could buy. The sentence landed like a verdict, plain and final. He tried to apologize. Words felt inadequate, the sort of clumsy trade that could not buy back dignity. She listened and then shared fragments of a life shaped by absence, villages erased, rivers diverted, kin traded, names given not for pity but to map thefts. As dusk fell they ate thin stew by lamplight. Conversation stayed to the edges, questions testing intent more than seeking answers. At one point she smoothed the fringe of her skirt, a small gesture that carried whole survival practices, the hidden chart of glass, the barefoot maps through country that did not always welcome her. Eli realized how little he had known and that listening could be an act of reparation, not repair. It began an accounting he owed. She slept on the floor, back to the wall, braid over one shoulder, hands folded. The rope lay coiled in a corner like evidence, present but unneeded. He sat awake long after, lamplight carving his face into hard lines, thinking of Dust Creek and the sheriff and the men who would come asking polite questions. The silence between them hummed, not hostile but charged, and in that charge hung a choice. The cabin no longer offered the false shelter of ownership. It had become an ambiguous space where consequences might be decided by human will rather than coin. He kept hearing the clink of those $2 in his head, a sound that would not be erased, each echo a tally of his complicity. She woke once and watched him in the lamplight. Their eyes met and exchanged something like a covenant, not mercy, not accusation, but assessment. Their emotions around the small room took on a careful intimacy. He fed the fire, she smoothed the board, axe made heavy by consequence. He thought again of his brother and of Halman disappeared into other men's choices, and the thought tightened him with a tenderness he had not earned. Outside, the hills kept their slow watch. Inside, under a thin roof, two lives rearranged the geometry between ownership and personhood. They built a small fire in the stove and let the room breathe around it, embers like quiet witnesses, and for the first time since the auction she uncoiled a story not to beg but to set things right in the only grammar she owned. By naming what the men of Dust Creek had tried to erase, she drew in her breath, long and steady, and began. Her voice was not small though it trembled at the edges. Braided dark brown hair falling over one shoulder with feathers that caught the lamplight. The light-colored bralette and the short patterned skirt moving with her as if clothes remembered histories. She spoke of a village that lay on a river like a promise, of winters counted by the way bundles of cedar smoked in the long houses, of children who learned the stars like letters. And she spoke of how settlers have come first like a rumor and then like a storm. Trades that shifted into theft, promises that narrowed into fences, and then the slow commerce of people traded for a coin or silence. Names given to a kin one dark market at a time until whole families were catalogued like grain in the river learned new owners' names. Eli listened in the half-light, hat set aside, dark hair mussed at the temple, the light blue shirt at his throat unbuttoned a notch as if his defenses had loosened, the vest slack with the fatigue of truth. His body occupied the room but his attention followed the cadence of each sentence as if the sound of it might rearrange the ledgers in his head. She told of elders taken under the pretense of treaties, of children hidden in wagons and sold in markets, of the way the settlers' law folded very politely around cruelty and called it progress. She named villages that had become maps of absence, and each name landed in the cabin like a small, bright stone thrown into his chest, ripples of guilt spreading until he could no longer pretend the surface was still. There were no dramatics in her telling, no pleas for pity, only a steady, furious inventory. The soft laugh of an ant drowned in a drunken brawl overland, a brother's arm that never quite healed after they forced him to move timber for a mill, the salty prayers at graves that marked not only the dead but the thefts that had led to the graves. When she paused, the fire filled the space with its small noises, and Eli felt the history she spoke like cold water running through his veins. He thought of his own family's losses, of the ledger that had taught him to count in columns, and he recognized how easy it had been to let numbers replace faces. Her fury was not wild, it was the slow, inevitable heat of someone who had stored grief like coal and now set a spark to it to see what would burn clean. She told him about the names they used for her, people in Dust Creek, derisive nicknames spat over beer, and how those names turned into shorthand that justified violence. They called us things, she said, voice steady now, so they wouldn't have to say sorry. The line cut through him. He could feel in that moment the entire moral geography of the West fold like paper, where law was supposed to be a map that had become a tombstone. He wanted to interrupt, to offer explanations that might smooth the edges, debts, survival, the hard arithmetic of frontier life, but for once he kept his mouth closed, because words could be a second kind of theft if they were offered as excuses. As she moved through the story she became not Lot 17 but a woman whose life had been braided into 1,000 small resistances. She spoke of songs sung quietly in the night to remember a language, of secret paths where children learned to run without leaving footprints, of the way they hid corn under river rocks so it would not be taken. Eli watched the tired set of her shoulders and the way her hands found their own shape when she described the hiding places of her people, hands that could unweave rope and stitch a life back together. In the lamplight he saw the faces of men from Dust Creek, their laughter echoing with the flat sound of $2, and he understood with a kind of pained clarity that the auction had been less an act than a symptom, a community practice in erasure. When she finished, the cabin held her silence like a newly named thing, and Eli felt an answering sort of shame, sharp, ungilded, that made his hands small and clumsy as he reached for a blanket. He had come to the hills to settle debts, and instead found himself settling into a quiet that demanded reparation rather than accounting. Her final words that night were soft but edged. "We are not items. We are not ledgers." They hung in the smoke they care like a promise and a warning, and Eli listened until the embers died and learned, painfully, how little $2 could say about the weight of a life. By morning the rumor had sharpened into a weapon. Dust Creek was a town that loved tidy stories, ledgers, auctions, names filed neat under columns, and the story that Eli had taken Indian property spread with the urgent cruelty of gossip, moving from saloon to livery to the sheriff's stoop like a wind-carrying dry tinder, until it caught the attention of men who preferred law as a blunt instrument. Eli learned of it the way small tragedies are often delivered in frontier towns, stumbling through the gate in a haze of whiskey and apologies. A messenger from the main road, cheeks flushed, tongue loose with bravado and fear, staggered into his yard, eyes darting, words tumbling out in a slur that made the news sound both smaller and larger than it was. "Sheriff's riding," he slurred, pointing a finger toward town. "Posses up, torches, rifles, asking who dare hide a squaw in the hills." The drunk's certainty had the sickening authority of any town's spoken verdict, and when Eli heard it the cabin's quiet seemed suddenly porous, as if the hills themselves could not hold secrets any longer. He watched the man leave, watched him disappear down the slope, and felt the old ledgered calculations return like a bad chapter he'd promised himself he'd finished. Only this time the sums on the page had faces attached. Inside the cabin, she sat on the floor in the lamplight, braid over one shoulder, feathers catching the light like accusation. The patterned skirt folded around knees, the light-colored bralette a pale marker against the lamplight. She looked smaller and larger at once, a contradiction made of bone and refusal. Eli had hoped the hills might render Dust Creek's laws distant, their collars too stiff to follow. Instead, the law came like weather, predictable, inexorable. He thought of the sheriff, a man made of protocol and grudges, bothered by anything that threatened the town's tidy logic. The thought of torches and rifles carved a cold path down his spine. He had imagined consequences before, debts unpaid, a ledger turned tight against his sleep, but he had not imagined faces lifted with righteous anger, nor the particular cruelty of men who would frame the rescue of a human being as interference with commerce. The posses of Dust Creek rode hard. Their horses' hooves had the sound of a verdict, and Eli heard the rhythm in his chest before he saw the dust rise on the road. In the pause before decision, he counted possible moves, hand her over and returned to the town's vain approval, staying with the ledger but losing something in himself. Plead with her and risk a chase that might end in blood, or stand and fight whatever law or mob came, and accept the cost. The drunk messenger's words had bruised the cabin's thin calm into decisive edges. He could see the sheriff's hat in his mind, the neat brim, the badge catching the sun. The sheriff's mouth used to telling other men what to do. He could hear the saloon's laughter turn to sober counsel, feel the town's capacity for indignation converted easily into violence. She watched him as he paced, long braids and feathers motionless. When he stopped, she looked at him with the same cool assessment she'd shown since the auction, as if measuring whether he was a man or merely a functionary of a town's cruelty. There was no pleading in her, only the steady accumulation of fact. Men come, men decide, people decide for others. Eli steadied himself on a chair, feeling the rope of consequence tighten. He had not meant to be a villain. He had meant to settle accounts and possibly to find a way out of the cycle that had howled his family. But intention is a small currency when the sheriff's badge is broad and the town's appetite large. He thought of his brother's face in the dark and how the brother had once stood in the way of men who thought force was the only grammar they needed. The choice that rose in him was simple in outline and monstrous in implication: protect her, or fold into the town's ledger and let the law carry away what it listed as property. He moved to the corner where the frayed rope lay, rolled it into his hands like a measure of his own failing, then set it down as if making a different kind of offering. He called the horse, no rage now, only the steady mechanics of someone who decided a moral line, and began to prepare for the impossible, to stand against a posse with torches and rifles, to to risk bullets for the truth that she was not a thing to be bought. His hands were steady because fear had carved them that way, but his chest felt like a bell, each beat counting the price. Outside, the road carried the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a low thunder. She rose when he rose, braids swinging, skirt fringe trembling, eyes not pleading but aligning with whatever plan his conscience would let him carry out. In that thin moment, the cabin felt both too small to hide them and large enough to contain a decision that would mark both their lives. He looked at her, at the feathers, at the steady set of her jaw, and quietly, without flourish, understood that the only thing left that would make him sleep would be the willingness to risk everything to keep her from being taken. He worked with the slow, mechanical care of a man making amends with a tool he'd used for years. The rifle was old but true, a long weight that fit his hands like memory, and he cleaned its barrel by lamplight as if each swipe might polish away the clink of $2 silver, then checked the chambers and set cartridges into a rough leather bandolier with fingers that trembled only a little. Outside, the hills kept patient, watching. The road hummed faintly with the approach of men who mistook noise for justice. When he set the rifle across the table, he looked up at her and saw the small, precise face he had driven away from town. Long, braided dark brown hair with feathers that shimmered like signals, skin fair to medium with dust and dusk settling in the hollows, the light-colored bralette clinging to the curve of her shoulder and the short patterned skirt folded in the knee like a map of home, fringe still carrying the morning's dew. He reached into a saddlebag and drew out a pistol, smaller, nearer to a person's hand, and held it out to her as if offering not only a weapon but a choice. She took it with a slow, deliberate motion, fingers closing round the grip, knuckles white in the lamplight, and for a moment the two of them were a tableau of odd intimacy. Man who'd bought and woman who'd been bought, an exchange made of steel and shame. She turned the pistol in her hands like someone turning a page to see what the next word would demand, and when she finally looked at him, she did not look with hatred so much as with a cold appraisal, the cut like winter. "You still think we fight the same?" she whispered, voice low and Dutch like a knife honed on sorrow. The question landed not as accusation but as a demand for honesty. He felt it like a ledger held up to his face. Eli's mouth opened as if to answer, and the words jammed behind his teeth. What could he say that would not sound like another purchase of mercy? He nodded once, shame pressed into the movement like a visible bruise, because the truth was smaller and harder than the lie he might tell. He still thought in the arithmetical force, even as his conscience whispered other ladders. She considered the pistol, then tucked it into the garter he had fashioned from a strip of his own shirt, an absurd, humble ceremony, and it was as if the gesture acknowledged that whatever arms they took now would be used on different terms. The night beyond the cabin's thin walls was a living thing. Distant thunder of hoofs rolled like prophecy, and the lamplight threw their shadows long and trembling against the boards. Two figures drawn in stark silhouette, one man still caught in habit, one woman freshly named by her refusal. He packed a satchel with spare cartridges, a canteen, bandages, and then hesitated over the rope, rolling it between his palms like a measure of his culpability before dropping it back into the corner where it would not be seen as a tool for domination but as a relic of the era they now sought to resist. She watched his hands, not with trust but with careful interest, and in the watching there was a quiet education. She taught him the difference between giving someone a weapon and trusting them with the truth of why violence might be necessary. "We don't fight the same," she said finally, not unkind, only factual, and then described in spare sentences the tactics she'd learned in other places, a way to move through country that left few traces, the small traps of misdirection, how to use silence as armor, how to aim not at men's faces but at the mechanisms that would make them stop. Eli listened, every word rearranging the geography of what he thought a fight should be. Suddenly strategy could be more than a series of shots, it could be a refusal to play by a town's rules. He felt humility like a new garment, ill-fitting at first, then gradually settling round the shoulders until it felt less like shame and more like armor. The distant thunder grew louder, and in that sound he imagined the posse's torchlight flaring against the hills like a swarm, preparing for war. He realized did not mean he had to become the sort of man who bought people. It meant he might have to be the kind of man who refused to let an injustice pass without consequence. They moved quietly, sharing small tasks, he loading, she checking sights, he bundling bandages, she knot in rawhide with fingers that showed no tremor when the moment demanded steadiness, and all the while words lay spare between them, economy of language learned from necessity. Outside, the wind gathered in the hollows and the night smelled of smoke and distant horses. Inside, the lamplight marked them as co-conspirators against a brittle order. In the corner, the rope waited like a story that had not yet ended. In his palm, the pistol felt like a pact, and in her eyes he read not surrender but resolve. That night, the cabin's silence was not empty. It was busy with purpose. They had prepared not only for the coming violence but for the moral reckoning that would follow, and as hoofbeats drew nearer, the two understood what the coming hours would require. Courage, yes, but also an honesty about the kinds of courage that were worth paying for. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. By dusk, the road to Dust Creek had turned into a ribbon of orange dust and hard intent, and the posse rode up like a marching verdict, torches bobbing, rifles slung but ready, faces set in the flat line of men who need no law to make a conclusion. Eli met them on the ridge with the awkward posture of a man who'd rehearsed answers in the dark and found they tasted like metal in his mouth. Hat pulled low, vest shadowing the unbuttoned throat of his light blue shirt. And before the sheriff could clear his throat, Eli told the small lie that felt like the last clean thing he could offer. She's gone. The word left him dry. It sounded like a confession in the mouth of a man who had learned to speak in balances and debts. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man with a badge that liked to shine, narrowed his eyes and barked orders. Sweep the hills, leave no scrub unchecked. But his voice had hardly cut the air when the retort came. A single gunshot, clear as flint, answering Eli's lie like a seal breaking on ice. The sound tore the night open. From the tree line, from a shadowed knoll where leaves stitched the dark together, the girl's silhouette stepped into a torn shaft of torchlight, long braided hair feathered and swinging, the patterned skirt dark at the hem, the pale broadlet visible for a heartbeat as she moved, and another flash cracked, her pistol answering the law with an anatomy of resistance. Then another and another, each report a punctuation that rewrote the town's tidy account books. The posse froze in a heartbeat of disbelief, then moved like a living tide, splitting and reforming, while Eli stood, hands naked at his sides, feeling the lie curl into him like smoke. The first torch caught a dry bush and the flame leapt with a greedy noise. Whether by plan or by the swarm's careless step, fire found tinder and fed. And soon the hills were not only noisy with rifle reports but burning with a light that turned faces into masks and sent birds shrieking from blackened branches. Dust Creek's torches reflected back from the cabin's windows like accusing eyes. Men shouted, orders tangled into frightened sentences, and the sheriff's calm splintered into command and fear. She moved through trees with a barefoot surety that mocked the clumsy cavalry of boots, skirt fringe snapping like a banner, braids whipping, hair feathers left bright against smoke. Her small pistol an extension of the will that had learned to survive by being quiet and then suddenly by not being quiet at all. The hills erupted, not just with the physical flame that crawled through dry brush and ate at fence posts, but with the heat of something older, hatred, shame, a collective guilt lit into panic. Dust Creek began to burn with its own hunger in the thatch, and clapboard took the night like a confession. Men who had laughed at $2 now ran for buckets, for water barrels, for anything that might staunch the orange teeth. Others took rifles and answered the night with lead, while women screamed and children clutched at blankets, faces lit by torchlight and terror. Eli's world narrowed to the combustive throb of his heartbeat and the sense that all his small reconciliations were ash at his boots. He watched her in the smoke, a figure of fierce smallness, and realized the truth of what she'd said at the auction like a prophesy turned present. You'll regret this, not aimed merely at him but at the rotten architecture of a town that thought coin could buy silence. The gunfire stuttered through the hills like a wild drum, and the wind took sparks and sent them spinning toward the town until roofs caught in lamplight became a halo of ruin. The posse, disciplined in theory, splintered into angry men and panicked men, and amidst the chaos the quiet arithmetic of the frontier, debts, ledgers, ownership, was shredded by smoke and bullets. She did not run as they might have expected. She moved with purpose, with small, deliberate actions, taking shots that aimed to disable wagons, to scatter riders, to make the path back to town costly. Every report of her pistol was a punctuation against a system that had attempted to name her as property. Eli found an old rope in his hands without thinking, then dropped it again, and the choice he had rehearsed all night condensed into a single bright moment. Stand with the town's law or stand with the woman whose existence it had tried to erase? Around them, Dust Creek convulsed, men yelling, roofs crackling, the night painted with orange in the metallic scent of fear, and in the bright, terrible light she became a small, fierce shape against the inferno, a woman who had been called Lot 17 and had answered with a storm. Dawn came like a question, pale and careful, and when the light found the hills it revealed a landscape that looked less like victory than like a ledger wiped by fire. Smoke hung low, braided in the hollows, ash-dusted faces and rafters, and the town of Dust Creek lay half unmade, roofs blackened, a few chimneys still coughing gray, wagon wheels splintered like ribs. Among the embers bodies were strewn with a blunt, final geometry of violence, men who had rallied for law, boys who had learned cruelty as inheritance, a few innocents caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the air tasted of iron and regret. Eli lay on his back near the low ridge where the fight had pooled, his shirt torn at the shoulder, the light blue fabric darkened with blood that slipped slow and stubborn into the dust. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, his wide-brimmed hat gone to some loose place where a skirmish had thrown it, and when he tried to inhale, the breath snagged with pain. He realized the wound was not merely flesh but letter deep, the tally of choices, the weight of $2 silver, the long arithmetic that had led him here. She was there, she had been there, kneeling at his side with a smaller urgency that had nothing to do with theatrics and everything to do with the clear, practical knowledge of survival. Her long, braided dark brown hair hung with damp leaves from the night, feathers tucked through it catching the day's weak sun like small flags. The patterned skirt now streaked with smoke and ash, the light-colored bralette smudged but holding, and her hands, calloused in ways that made them efficient, pressed a cloth to the wound with a steadiness that belied the exhaustion in her face. Around them the ruined town murmured, men muttered, some wept with hands to mouths. A child wandered barefoot among the wreckage like a pale ghost. The sheriff's badge lay battered in the mud, a symbol now as battered as the man who'd worn it, and somewhere a woman sang softly, a small steadiness against the louder noise. Eli tasted the cloth, iron, sweat, the faint bitter tang of the night smoke, and let himself be held in the practical business of being tended to by a person he'd tried to own. She did not look triumphant. Her eyes were hot with something that was not glee but the slow flame of justice finally doing its work. You shouldn't have stayed, she murmured, voice low and ragged with a tiredness that carried no accusation, only fact. Eli tried to make his face fit a shape that would do penance, a hard set, a confession. Instead, a weak smile slipped out, a small thing like a sun through cloud. You were right, he said, words thin as paper but true. I regret it all. The sentence was not a neat absolution. It was a raw entry, regret for coins thrown like insults, for silence kept when the world needed speaking, for the ways he'd folded into a community that prized lives as if numbers could stand in for names. She listened, not for apology but to know whether the man beside her would change, whether remorse would be a story told once or a path walked. Around them, survivors began the work a burned town always asks: find water, shelter the wounded, mark the dead with whatever dignity remains. The girl, no longer Lot 17 here but a woman who had unmade a town's small certainties, moved through the tasks with an economy of motion that suggested both grief and relief. She gave orders to a trembling farmer, directed the loading of a wagon with soft authority, wrapped a child's scraped knee with practiced hands, actions that stitched the raw day into something survivable. Eli watched and felt the world rearrange itself. Men who had thought themselves holders of power now shuffled like damaged books. Some muttered oaths, some turned their backs, and a few, small and important, bent to help where they had been the cause. He thought of his brother in the cold clarity that pain allows, of the ledger that had taught him to count first and see later, and he realized that regret without action would be only wind. I can fix this, he croaked, voice weak but stubborn. She looked at him, a direct, unflinching gaze that had seemed too much to be mollified by promises, and in her expression he read not immediate trust but a possibility offered. Do what you must to make amends. He reached for her hand, awkward and sincere, fingers finding the cloth she'd folded into a bandage, and in that small contact there was no ownership but a pact, the kind that stitches two lives to a new course. Around them the smoke thinned as if the land itself, having received a confession in flame, might be willing to accept a change of heart. Crows came back to the charties and called, a plain sound, as if to bear witness. The town would have to reckon, rebuild or dissolve, name the truth or bury it longer. For Eli, the wound was a map. For her, another step in the long, patient erasure of wrongs. They sat in the thin dawn, a man and a woman not bound by coin but by consequence, and somewhere in the bone-deep hush of the ruined street a new story began to shadow the old, a caution, yes, but also a claim, that lives refuse to be counted as less, and that sometimes, when silence breaks, the world rearranges itself into something that might, finally, resemble justice. She left him by the river as if undoing a knot at last. No drama, no backward glance that could be mistaken for gratitude. Just the quiet economy of a woman who had learned that departures are their own ceremonies. The morning unfolded in thin gold, the sun low and honest, and her bare feet met the cold sand with the sound of a thing returning to itself. Each step deliberate, a metronome for a heart that had been hammered into new rhythm by blood and smoke. Her long, braided dark brown hair swung against her back, feathers catching the light like tiny flags for a life reclaimed. The light-colored bralette clinging to the curve of her shoulders where the night's work had left its marks. The patterned wraparound skirt brushing her knees, French whispering over the sand in orange, brown, Asian blue-gray that read like memory. Behind her, Eli lay where the river bent, a man caught in the geometry of consequence, dark hair plastered with grime, his shirt open at the throat, vest skewed, the wound bandaged with the cloth she'd offered. He watched her go with an expression that was less pleading than stunned, as if the world had rearranged itself and left him a map with missing lines. She walked not to be seen, but because the road demanded movement. The auction block's echo had been a weight she would not carry, each footfall a small erasure of the name they had pinned to her, Lot 17, until the title slid off like a rotten bark. The river ran honest and indifferent, water turning light into shards, and she stepped along its edge like a woman tracing the border between what had been done to her and what she might yet do for herself. The land around her held a brittle calm, charred timbers in the distance, a few blackened roofs where the town had tried to stand its story, crows already picking at the morning's carcass, and yet the plain itself seemed to accept her passage with the slow grace of something that had seen worse and kept its eyes open. She did not hurry. Haste would have been thief-like, impatience like an admission that someone else's catalog still mattered. Instead, she walked with the slow attention of someone who had measured loss and decided to spend her energy differently, on steps that belonged to her and to no ledger. Her feet recorded a language on the riverbank, prints that meant history, prints that said I was here and I am going. Occasionally she paused, not from fatigue but to listen to the world wake, the way the river murmured against stones, the distant complaint of a wagon passing by, the thin call of a hawk. Memory rose in small images, hammer on wood, men's laughter, the clink of $2 silver, but she let them surface like things observed in a mirror and then turned away, refusing to fold them into the new geography she was tracing. Eli's figure grew smaller until he was a study in wound and regret, hands at his side, eyes tracking her with a kind of private apology. But she did not look back. Her attention was forward, to the sun itself, which climbed with a patience that felt like promise. She thought of names, the names of the tribe, the names erased by treaties and trades, the names she carried in quiet like seeds. Each step seemed to plant one of those seeds in the soil the town had thought it owned. Each step felt like a small undoing of the market's letter. The fringe of her skirt fluttered as a breeze passed, and she fancied for a moment that the land itself acknowledged her right to move across it. No sale, no permission required, only the ancient, impartial welcome of earth underfoot. No one hailed her with hallelujahs. No one sang her homecoming. Freedom in the morning was a private thing, messy and unfinished, and that suited her. By the time the sun had cleared the hills, she had become a simple silhouette against a wide sky, a woman who had been named, sold, and who had answered with a refusal that had reshaped a town. The prints behind her softened as the river's edge reclaimed them, and she let the water smooth the last visible marks of the auction. With each step she left less of Lot 17 and more of the woman who had decided she would not obey. Dusk Creek woke to a Nash silver morning that smelled of burned timbers and the bitter tang of things finally named. People spilled into streets with faces washed in smoke, eyes ringed by sleeplessness, and the town moved like a body that had learned it had a wound, careful at first, then with the clumsy momentum of those who must either heal or deny. Roof rafters smoldered, shutters dangled, the saloon sign hung crooked, and where the auction block had once stood, men now avoided the space as if it had become a truth too sharp to step on. Whispers gathered like scavengers, and the story of the previous night, of torches and gunfire, of roofs catching and men running, grew deep as people told it to one another in the low, urgent language of survivors. Some called her a curse, the kind of spirit that strips pretension down to bone. They spat and pointed at the hills as if the ground itself had conspired against their pride. Others, quiet, small in number but steady, called her a saint, and said the word almost as if it could staunch an ache in the chest by being spoken aloud. Between those poles the town's reckonings rippled. A muleteer who'd laughed at the auction now bent to lift charred beam with shaking hands. The sheriff, badged Eldon, face pale, walked the ruined street counting consequences with fingers that trembled. A widow who'd once muttered insults at the sight of the girl now hugged a child close and refused to meet her own eyes when the town's talk turned to blame. Stories braided into myth before noon. Someone swore the girl had walked through fire untouched, that her braids had flown like a banner and feathers had been lit and stayed unburned. Another claimed she'd shot the sheriff's horse from under him and disappeared like a hawk. A child swore he saw her name carved into a new kind of letter, the town's conscience, where once had been only prices and tallies. Eli moved among them like a man in a changed country, wounded, bandaged, hands stained not only with soot but with the knowledge of what his coins had bought and undone. And when people met his eyes, some flinched, some offered terse thanks, some refused to look at him at all, because he carried on him the residue of the terrible arithmetic, the $2 silver that had been a spark. He answered no questions, words felt inadequate, and confession without labor felt like an empty altar. Instead, he spent the morning hauling water, helping lift a collapsed porch, ferrying a child from a ruined house to a neighbor with gentler hands. In those small emotions he tried to barter remorse into action, to translate regret into muscle. The sheriff convened a meeting at the courthouse. If law could be a place for truth, it should be tried there. But the meeting fractured into arguments over blame, over whether the town had been justified in hosting its auctions the way it had, over whether men who traded in people had been following custom or committing crimes. Some men defended the old order with a kind of half-hearted rhetoric that sounded like habit more than conviction. We did what the market allowed, they said. Voices then. Others, driven by shame or fear of the same reckoning, spoke of closing the auction, of writing new rules, of paying reparations, words that felt brave until one looked for the follow-through. The more decisive acts came not in the courthouse but in quiet corners. A group of women from different households pooled blankets and food and set off toward the hills where the fighting had been worst, determined to find survivors. A teacher gathered children and taught them to name things properly, names that had been lost to trade and convenience, and in doing so started a tiny, fierce reclamation. By midday the rumor that the woman, no longer merely Lot 17 in those who remembered, had walked away barefoot toward the rising sun had become a legend with many edges. Some said she would return to haunt the town's auctions. Others said she would teach those who had been taken how to run like river water. More than one songsmith in the square began to stitch her into verse, a melody that braided fire, river, and a refusal that would not be boxed. The landscape of culpability shifted as neighbors met and measured their own roles. A few men who had cheered in the auction now found hands empty of cheer, and their silence said as much as any apology. Eli watched these reckonings with a new kind of attention. He had thought to buy a quiet life and found instead a loud one where his choices echoed like gunshots, and he could not unhear them. In the ash and the clean air that followed, the town had a decision to make. Would it bury the story under hurried repairs and keep its ledgers uncluttered? Or would it let this convulsion become a curriculum, a slow remapping of how people counted each other? By noon, when the sun burned down dust motes into practical light, someone set up a simple marker where the auction block had stood, stones piled by hand, a crude memorial not only to those taken but to the town's failure to see. And people left offerings there, a hat, a ribbon, a small token of food. The legend did not wait for consensus. It grew in corners, in whispers, in the quiet repair of broken things, and already there were those who would tell the tale as warning and those who would turn it into praise. Dust Creek would never quite look the same. Because the truth had been thrown into the open and refused to be sewn shut, Eli lay half buried in the ash of the ridge, a man whose shape the fire had marked like a blackened coin, ribs rising and falling with a careful, stubborn rhythm, dark hair matted to his forehead, the brim of his hat crushed beside him, the light blue shirt at his throat stained and open where bandages had been tied, and as the morning wind swept low across the ruined town, it carried away the last sticky tang of smoke and left in its place a thin, steady cold that felt almost like judgment. He watched the horizon with the sort of attention that comes only when a man has been pared down to essentials: breath, bone, the small business of surviving. And her voice, the 3 words she'd spoken in the auction square, kept folding back into his head, not as accusation but as truth spoken ahead of time. "You'll regret this." It had not been a threat then, and it was not a threat now. It had been a prophecy, the concise naming of a consequence that would grow like a weed through a town's ledger, and he felt it bloom in the ash around him. Regret, not his private guilt tucked away in a pocket, but a communal sickness that touched roofs and hands and the very idea of law. Around him, Dust Creek moved with a weary industriousness, sweeping, hauling, lifting ruined boards, burying shards of glass in the occasional body with a respect that looked more like obligation than absolution, while other hands, those raw with shame, set right what their laughter had broken. He could see her in his mind in small flashes: long, braided dark brown hair threaded with feathers, skirt fringe flickering as she walked, the pale broadlet clinging like an oath to her shoulders, feet moving with the old certainty of someone who knows ground not by deeds but by memory. And in those memories she was not vengeful so much as inevitable, a law of nature that man had to reckon with. The land itself seemed to register the moral accounting. Where once the auction had stood as a bland piece of commerce, now the grass grew thin and cautious, the ground bearing the tracks of hurried hoofs and the slow steps of those who had chosen to help. Even the river, which had once been a mirror to men's justifications, now flowed with a cleaner glint, as if it had washed itself of complicity and would henceforth keep a different record. Eli thought of law, the sheriff's neat hat, the courthouse's wooden bench, and realized for the first time that law without conscience is architecture without shelter. It may stand, but it offers no refuge. Men had used law to dress cruelty and protocol, had traded in human names the way they traded in wagons and oats, and the town had prospered on a ledger that counted less carefully than grief. Now the law creaked under a weight it hadn't been designed to bear: accountability. His own body ached in ways his ledger never accounted for. Blood had its own arithmetic and demanded payment in a currency no book could tally. He had been taught to measure worth in coin and claim, and those teachings had left him with $2 and a ruin he could not reconcile. The horizon held nothing dramatic, only the slow, indifferent movement of clouds and the curve of the land. But to his mind it was full of consequences, neighbors who might change, or not, children who might grow to ask why the town had ever thought to buy a person, a woman who had walked away and become myth. Regret, he understood now, is not a private sorrow but a field that changes the crop of the whole place. It sours friendships, it hollows out jokes, it forces men to carry more than they once believed they owned. He felt, achingly, the truth of her refusal, that a life cannot be catalogued without theft, that ownership of another is a sham that eventually feeds back on the holder, eating trust, making the holder small and brittle. The wind lifted a scrap of paper, a town notice, maybe, and it spun across his knees like a mocking coin, then settled, slow, as if even the weather had paused to read the town's new margins. He imagined the children she'd spoken of, learning their proper names again, and the elders mending a language that had been frayed, and in that imagining found a small, defiant hope. The narrator's voice, if there is a voice that can speak truth without shaking, leans close now, not to scold but to ask, because the story does not end with a single man's confession nor with a single town's flames. It spreads like seed and wind, and it requires an answer from anyone listening to history's small echoes. When a man buys another's freedom, who's truly own? If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.